Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is concepts lecture number 4 on representation of mimesis. Mimesis is not really the most common word, even in the art world, but it's a really fundamental term. It means all the things that you see on the screen here: realism, naturalism, depiction, denotation, representation, the invisible, the undepictable, the unrepresentable, the inconceivable. It's a kind of an underlying term which is very, very helpful to think about ways that your artwork is related to the world. So as a general definition, it means the representation or imitation of the real world in art and literature. When you say, my work is realistic, or I'm not trying to represent the world, then you're using terms that are related to mimesis. Mimesis is a Greek word, and a lot of the terms that are used are Latin or Greek, and they descend from mimesis. That picture, by the way, that's a piece by Joan Marie Kelly, who's an artist who's based in Singapore. She visits marginal communities, places in this case where languages are endangered, and she teaches, in this case, kids to draw and paint. So their mimesis is involved in many different ways in these projects, in the language and in the images. There are two different kinds of mimesis. Narrow mimesis is when you depict things as they appear. And that would include most film and photography, and Western art in general, from the Renaissance to modernism and other traditions that try to mimic the world in different ways. Broad mimesis is when the artwork asks to be compared to the world, that it refers to the world in some way, but it doesn't depict the world. For example, abstract painting. Those broad and narrow distinctions are, I think, maybe not as useful as the more detailed ones that I'm going to spend most of this talk describing. Words like these. So realism, naturalism, depiction, denotation, representation, these are all examples of mimesis. Realism, to start with that, was an artistic movement around 1850, which was opposed to Romanticism, earlier 19th century movement. Realist painters wanted to show the realities of political and social life. That's an early painting by Courbet, who was interested in depicting realistically some aspects of class structure in society in France, and at the same time also interested in depicting, as you can see, in a very direct and literal way, in this self-portrait, the appearance of the world. Outside the art world, realism just means being realistic, and it can apply to any art. But in the art world, it's really best to use this word realism to describe this particular moment in Western art history in the middle of the 19th century. Naturalism is a broader word. It means any art that is supposed to look like the world is naturalistic. Naturalism is usually applied to Renaissance art, but it can be used, and it is used, to describe art of any culture that attempts to mimic the world in this way, in a naturalistic way. This is an early perspective painting in which the artist is doing his best to show off the fact that he knows one-point perspective. So naturalism in art history tends to be used in both the narrow and the broad sense. In its narrow sense here, it means really 15th century and some 16th century Italian art in particular. But in the broad sense, it's used to describe art of any number of cultures. So representation is the broadest and most abstract of this first set of words. The OED, which you see on the right, defines it, as you can probably see right in the middle there, meaning number 1, as the action of standing for or in the place of a person, group, thing, and so on. If you follow that definition, which is the standard non-art world English language definition, then all art is representation. But when art, quote unquote, stands for the way things look, then it falls under the heading mimesis. Broad mimesis stresses the relationship or dialogue between the art object and the world. So a representation, on the other hand, could just be a token, like this Nike swoosh. Representation is usually a word that you encounter in philosophy classes, in liberal art, and and not so much in art history. Depiction is an older word. This is what you get if you put depiction into the Google Ngram site, that it's faded a little bit since the end of the 20th century. I'm not sure exactly why that is, kind of interesting, but it feels like an older word. And it mainly refers to the action of painting or drawing itself. And if you look it up in the dictionary, you see that depiction is really closely tied to individual media, especially drawing. And that leaves denotation on this first list. This is another philosophic term, like representation. It was especially important for Nelson Goodman, the 20th century American philosopher. He argued against the idea that an artwork has to resemble something, that it has to be naturalistic or realistic in order to represent it. That's a little counterintuitive, and maybe I should say that again. Goodman was interested in arguing against the idea that an artwork has to resemble something in order to represent it. So representation is broader than naturalism. So an example in Nelson Goodman's book is music notation. He says music notation denotes music performance, so that you can read a score, a musician can read a score and perform a piece, so it denotes a performance, but music notation doesn't resemble the performance. He was interested in splitting the idea of naturalistic correspondence from the much broader idea of denotation. I have more to say about him because he's interesting and important for other reasons in Concepts Lecture 20. So that's a first set of words that you can use, that are used to describe different forms of mimesis in art. And among these, you can pick and choose the ones that seem right for you. If you're interested in realistic, naturalistic art, then you have these two words, realism, naturalism, and the kind of underlying word, mimesis, that you can use to describe the kind of thing that you're doing. If you're interested, on the other hand, in kinds of art making that aren't naturalistic or realistic and don't seem mimetic, that they don't seem that they're actually mimicking something, they don't correspond to something, they don't look like anything in the world, then you have these other words, especially denotation and the general word representation, to think about how your art is related to the world. Then there's a whole set of terms for things that don't end up in art, things that are invisible, undepictable, unrepresentable, inconceivable. You can see in that list of four that two of them are the opposites of the words that I was just looking at. So this is a whole vocabulary for art that doesn't want to respond to the world or that can't respond to the world. And it's very useful and interesting to think of cultural and media differences between these four and a couple of other related terms. There are a lot of other terms, especially in Greek and ancient Roman writing, for things like mimesis. There's a word emulation, and if you look that up, you'll find whole books written on that. Superatio, or overcoming, is another word that was used in Latin. And that word imitation has its own history. So I'm really only talking about a couple of these that I think are the most important. This is a diagram that Paul Klee drew to explain the way that he was thinking about mimesis. He shows an I on the left. That's so the thing on the left says auga, which means I, and then right below it says ich, which means I, capital I, the self. So that I on the left is looking at the world on the right, which is also labeled du, which means you, the world or you. And optically, the world comes to the eye by way of light. You see the arrow pointing to the left. But a lot of other things are involved here. What Klee calls the world up at the top and the earth down at the bottom, which may be entirely non-visual. So I just have this diagram to suggest that this is quite a complicated theme. When you start asking yourself, what is there in art beyond mimesis? What are the things that don't work, or that decline mimesis or refuse mimesis? Then it gets complicated to ask. That gets complicated to answer, because many different things can be refused. So taking those new words one by one, first of all, the invisible would be the opposite of visibility, which I talked about in the first concepts lecture. The example was this astronomical object GN-Z11, which in 2020 was the most distant object visible in the universe. So visibility is what a given culture or medium is capable of visualizing. That was the term that we were looking at in the first concepts lecture. But of course, not all things are visible. Each culture and each medium has its limits to what they can make visible. Sometimes those limits are intentional. If you focus as an artist on what's at the very limits of the visible, then you create what Dieter Mersch calls Zerzeigung, which means showing asunder, showing in a broken way. Mimesis interrupts itself by reflecting on itself. So he's talking about artwork that deliberately pushes the limits of what's visible, so that the whole idea of depiction or making visible breaks down. Here's an example. This is a photo by Fiona Crisp. She did this project called Subterranea, where she went into big underground spaces like storage sites for nuclear materials, places like that, and she took these photographs. The idea was not to light them fully or adequately, because she wanted to stress the feeling of the vast dark spaces. So she's working here at the limits of visibility intentionally, and it's the kind of thing that causes that breakdown. You're aware of the fact that you're not seeing. You're aware of the fact that the artist hasn't let you see, and that's what the work is about. I have two other examples of this from art practices. There's a Canadian photographer, P. Elaine Sharp. She did a series called Unanswered Witness. So these are photographs of places where something violent took place. For example, she's a picture of Hitler's bunker, where Hitler died by suicide. And what she did was, when she went to these places, she focused on the spot in the air where the events might have taken place, and the rest of it is all blurred. So if the person had been there, if the people had been in these rooms when these violent acts took place, they would have been in focus, but they're not. Nothing is in focus. So again, right at the limits of visibility in order to make these into a meditation on what can be shown and what can't. There's a French art historian, Georges Didier Huberman, who writes really well on this kind of subject. He says, we must try, before the image, to think the negative force within it. There is a work of the negative in the image, a dark efficacy that, so to speak, eats away at the visible, the order of represented appearances, and murders the legible, the order of signifying configurations. So I don't want to take the time to unravel that sentence, but you can see the general interest in places where representation, in this case, a naturalistic representation, because these are photographs, places where representation fails, where it breaks down, where it doesn't work. And the last example of this is the most famous one, Gerhard Richter. He's done a number of paintings which he based on photographs, but in the paintings everything is smeared. And one of his constant subjects has been German history, and especially the Nazi past. And so by looking at these images in this way, by presenting them in this way, he's conjuring the blurriness of memory, of course, but since he's doing it to a photograph, it's clear that it's entirely intentional. So this is, again, working at the limits of visibility intentionally, as opposed, by the way, to that astronomical image because scientists are always trying to improve their images, whereas all three of these art examples, they're trying to disimprove their images. They're trying to get away from adequate or full representation or mimesis. The next word in this list is the undepictable, and that would be whatever you can't put into a picture because of the limits of your medium or your level of skill. So I went looking for an unskilled painting to put up here as an example. I ended up on the website of the Museum of Bad Art in Boston, which is full of paintings that are very successful. They're funny because the artist lacked specific skills. So this is not a judgment about how successful the artwork might be, but it's simply a description. The undepictable is, in this case, something that's beyond the skill of the artist. But if you think of it in terms of medium, every medium has its limitations, things that it can't handle. Every piece of technology has its limitations. So if you're interested in that as an artist, you can exploit that. You can make works that are about the undepictable, the things that don't work in your medium, the things that don't work at your level of skill. So the unrepresentable is then whatever you can't imagine as an image, or whatever you're not permitted to put into an image. My example from concept lecture 1 was child pornography, which is prohibited in a number of countries. So that's something which you're not permitted to put into an image, or in that case, even to own as an image. But it's also whatever you cannot imagine how to put into an image. An example from older art would be abstract ideas, like ideas of the holy, or ideas that seem to exist only in words. So, for example, this painter couldn't have imagined that he could represent God or Christian ideas like mercy, charity, and hope, but he could represent conventional symbols of them, conventional forms of them, like figures of Mary and Jesus. And the last of these concepts in this list is the inconceivable. And that is whatever you don't think of representing. It doesn't even occur to you that you could represent it. In this case, there would be lots and lots of examples of things this artist didn't conceive of representing, but to take a kind of historically plausible example, the artist would never have thought about putting in signs of Islam, even though Europe was in contact with Islamic culture, that should have said, in those years. And a more recent example of the inconceivable. This is a mid-19th century photograph of a woman in New Orleans and her slave. This photograph was presumably made this way in order to show the owner's status. So she had to commission these photographs, and so she puts a slave into the photograph in order to show her status and her wealth. One of the scholars who studies these photographs, Matthew Fox Amato, says that it might also have been done to show her clemency, that she shows that she was a good owner by putting this person into her photograph. That may also be true. Our reactions to her photograph, seeing a thing like this, would have been inconceivable to her. So the inconceivable is sometimes things that are historically specific, like in the previous example, and other times inconceivable is things that you can't think of for your own art because they would take you completely out of yourself and your historical period if you were able to conceive them. So mimesis is an enormous category. It covers all kinds of relationships between your work and the world. Those first set of concepts that I was talking about are all kind of like formative and generative and definitional, and you can use them to orient your practice. And the second set are all about strategies for breaking down or disrupting or thinking about the limitations of different kinds of mimesis. It can take a lifetime of practice to figure out what kinds of relationships you want to have with mimesis, and these are really only just like a dozen of the most basic terms. Beyond this, there's a real forest of literature that you can explore if you look up any one of these words.